He was walking through the entrance of the Dakota with Yoko Ono when a voice called his name. A single call, sharp, precise. The kind of tone that makes you turn your head even when you know you shouldn't. Before anyone could understand what was happening, the sound of gunfire burst through the quiet courtyard. John Lennon collapsed instantly, the shock freezing his body before the pain even reached him. Blood spread across the pavement as he struggled to breathe, his mind still trying to make sense of the violence that had just torn through him. The shooter did not run. He did not panic. He simply stood there, motionless, almost calm, holding a paperback book as if he were waiting for someone to finish a conversation. Inside the Dakota, people screamed. Outside, the world felt suspended. And in the middle of all of it, Lennon lay fading, his pulse slipping away with every second. Paramedics rushed him into the emergency room. Doctors opened his chest. They massaged his heart with their hands. They searched for signs of life, a pulse, a breath, a flicker behind the eyes. But the blood loss was catastrophic. His body was shutting down faster than anyone could stop it. Within minutes, everything went still. The forensic team documented 4 devastating wounds. 2 shots entered through the left shoulder, tearing through muscle, tendon, and connective tissue like a blade through fabric. 2 more entered through the back. 1 traveled upward, cutting through the chest cavity and ripping into the left lung before exiting. The other slammed into the lung as well, stopping only when it lodged inside the base of the neck. The throat filled with internal bleeding. Airways collapsed. The left lung was destroyed. Major vessels around the heart were torn apart. The cause of death was massive internal hemorrhage, a collapse from the inside out. Contrary to myth, the bullet never touched his heart. But the damage around it was so extensive that the result was the same. Even if he had reached the hospital faster, nothing would have reversed the disaster unfolding inside his chest. His body simply did not have enough blood left to sustain his life. Earlier that same afternoon, John Lennon had been in his apartment with photographer Annie Leibovitz. He insisted that Yoko be included in the portrait, refusing the idea of a solo image. The final result became one of the most intimate and haunting photographs ever taken of the couple. A moment of vulnerability captured just hours before everything collapsed. He left the Dakota to head to the studio, focused and upbeat. He spent the evening working on Yoko's track, adding details, talking about future plans, sounding more energized than he had in years. In an interview recorded not long before leaving the apartment, he admitted something that now feels painfully prophetic. That he did not know how he would survive if Yoko died first, and that he hoped he would be the one to go before her. No one in the room realized those words were becoming true in real time. When he returned to the Dakota earlier that day, still in the sunlight, a fan was waiting outside with a copy of Double Fantasy. John stopped. He smiled. He signed the album. He asked if the young man needed anything else. The fan was Mark David Chapman. That signature became the last autograph John Lennon ever gave. Chapman appeared quiet in public, the kind of man no one would point out in a crowd. But inside, he was a storm of obsession and resentment, slowly forming a worldview where murder equaled significance. Months earlier, he had flown to New York intending to kill Lennon. He went back home, claiming he had thrown away his gun, promising his wife he had abandoned the idea. It was a lie. Chapman wasn't driven by politics or revenge or anything personal. He was driven by a hunger to be noticed, to stamp his name into history in the most grotesque way possible. He worshipped the catcher in the rye, seeing himself as a modern version of Holden Caulfield. To him, Lennon had become a phony, a symbol of hypocrisy, a man preaching peace while living a life Chapman found too luxurious, too famous, too untouchable. In the book he carried that night, he wrote a single message. To Holden Caulfield, from Holden Caulfield, this is my statement. Chapman had prepared an alternate list of victims: Paul McCartney, Elizabeth Taylor, Johnny Carson, Jacqueline Kennedy. Anyone with enormous fame qualified. Lennon simply walked into the crosshairs because he was accessible. Years later, Chapman admitted the truth without hesitation. He wanted notoriety, nothing else. If Lennon had been less famous, he would still be alive. On the day before the shooting, Chapman confronted musician James Taylor at a subway station. Taylor would later recall the encounter with chills, describing Chapman's sweat, his frantic breathing, and his bizarre attempt to talk about Lennon, as if the murder were already rehearsed. The final photograph, taken by Annie Leibovitz, nearly didn't appear in the magazine. She believed releasing it so soon after the murder would be exploitative. But the image became one of the most recognized covers in the history of Rolling Stone. When the news broke, it happened in the middle of a Monday night football broadcast. Announcer Howard Cosell hesitated, arguing that such a tragedy did not belong inside a sports broadcast. His co-host insisted, and a moment later, millions of viewers heard the words that stopped the game, the night, and the world. And in a twist that defies explanation, Chapman's wife never divorced him. They remain married, meeting during controlled conjugal visits, cooking together in the small window of hours the prison allows. It is a chapter of the story that many still struggle to understand. Behind the fame, Lennon carried a lifetime of damage. His father, Alfred Lennon, drifted in and out of his childhood like a stranger. When John met him again as an adult, he chose to walk away from the relationship entirely. The real father figure who shaped his early years was his uncle George Smith, the man who taught him to read, to draw, and gave him his first instrument. George died suddenly of a liver hemorrhage when John was still young, leaving a hole that never closed. But the tragedy that scarred him deepest happened when he was 17. His mother, Julia, was struck and killed by an off-duty police officer right after leaving her sister's house. The loss shattered him, and the officer later found himself delivering mail on the route that included Paul McCartney's family home, a cruel reminder attached to his daily routine. Lennon's adult life wasn't cleaner. His son, Julian, often described him as a hypocrite, a man who preached peace but failed to offer it at home. There were addictions too. He fell into heroin at the same time the Beatles were struggling with internal tension. The drug fed his anger, fueling volatile moments in the studio and at home. He later admitted openly that in his younger years he had been violent in relationships, calling himself a hitter, a confession he carried with both shame and clarity. Then came the so-called Lost Weekend, a long and chaotic chapter with May Pang, filled with alcohol, emotional turmoil, and unpredictable behavior. It was a spiral he eventually escaped, but it left its mark on the people around him. Before the world tried to make sense of the tragedy, another storm was already gathering behind the scenes, a storm built by governments, politicians, and institutions that saw Lennon not as an artist, but as a threat. The Federal Bureau of Investigation had been watching Lennon closely for years, not casually, not out of curiosity, but with intent. Agents kept transcripts of his phone calls. They monitored the people he associated with. They tracked his movements through New York and his involvement with political activists. More than 300 pages of surveillance, memos, internal warnings, and reports were amassed, all under the belief that Lennon might influence the youth of America against the government's interests. President Richard Nixon was at the center of this paranoia. He feared Lennon's power, his presence at rallies, his charisma, and the way crowds responded to him with near religious devotion. Nixon believed Lennon could help mobilize young voters, and that alone was enough to place the musician in political crosshairs. For half a decade, the government attempted to deport him. Every extension of his visa became a new excuse to push him out of the country. and every attempt failed. Only when Nixon's presidency collapsed under the weight of Watergate did the pressure finally ease. What political power had denied him for years, the legal system finally granted permanent residency. But the scars of that pursuit, of being hunted by his own adopted country, never truly went away. Long before Chapman appeared with a gun in his pocket, Lennon was grappling with another controversy, one that revolved around creativity, originality, and a single line in a Beatles song. Come Together, one of the most recognizable tracks on Abbey Road, was accused of borrowing too heavily from Chuck Berry's You Can't Catch Me. The lawsuit wasn't purely about melody. It hinged on a phrase, a cadence, a sense of déjà vu that the plaintiff insisted was more imitation than inspiration. Lennon acknowledged the influence, but denied the intent. To settle the case, he agreed to record several songs connected to the claimant. But even then, the matter dragged on. Arguments erupted, accusations of broken agreements, unauthorized releases. The legal battle left a sour taste, a reminder that even at the height of his talent, Lennon's world was never fully his own. For millions of fans, Lennon's voice symbolized rebellion, peace, and artistic freedom. But for Mark David Chapman, that same voice became a symbol of betrayal. Years earlier, Lennon had made a statement that ignited controversy around the world, that the Beatles were more popular than Jesus. To some, it was philosophical. To others, it was blasphemy. To Chapman, who clung to a rigid, distorted version of religious devotion, it was unforgivable. But resentment alone was not enough to push a man into murder. What truly poisoned Chapman's mind was something far darker, the belief that by killing Lennon, he would become someone. He believed the world would know his name. He believed history would carve out a place for him. He believed the murder would transform him from an invisible man into an eternal one. The frightening truth is this: Chapman did not want Lennon dead. He wanted himself alive, in a way he had never been before. And in his twisted logic, Lennon's fame was the ladder he chose to climb. When news of Lennon's death spread, cities around the world fell into an eerie quiet. At the Dakota, the sidewalk filled with thousands of fans. Candles melted onto the concrete. Flowers piled at the gate. People cried openly, strangers embracing strangers, united by loss. In Liverpool, crowds of more than 20,000 gathered, their faces lit by vigil candles, their voices trembling through the cold air as they sang the songs he left behind. Radio stations stopped regular programming. Television networks interrupted their broadcasts. Newspapers across continents printed front-page tributes before dawn. It felt less like the death of a musician and more like the collapse of an idea. The idea that idealism, art, and human vulnerability could survive in a world increasingly shaped by violence. Even decades later, people still gather at Strawberry Fields in Central Park. Tourists still visit the Dakota. Fans still whisper, "Imagine," under their breath when they stand at the mosaic circle that bears the word he turned into an anthem. Time moved on, but the scar remains. Behind the public grief lay a devastation that no camera could capture. Yoko Ono, who had shared every creative breath with him, was brought into the hospital where doctors delivered the news that shattered her world. She left the building in silence, refusing to allow Lennon's body to be photographed, refusing a funeral, refusing anything that would turn his death into spectacle. She later released a statement urging fans not to give in to despair, insisting that John would have hated to see his passing spark more violence. Their son, Sean, was only 5 years old. He would grow up knowing his father more through stories, songs, and archived interviews than memories. For those closest to Lennon, the aftermath was not measured in crowds, tributes, or headlines, but in the quiet spaces he once filled, the unfinished melodies he left behind, and the haunting knowledge that he died only steps from the place he called home. Mark David Chapman was sentenced to a term of 20 years to life. He has been denied parole multiple times and remains behind bars to this day. Yet one part of his story remains unsettling. His wife, Gloria, never divorced him. She visits him for limited, tightly monitored hours each year. They cook meals together, talk, and hold on to a bond that outsiders struggle to comprehend. Chapman has repeatedly admitted that he killed Lennon for fame, for the attention, for the sense of significance he believed life had denied him. He now claims to feel remorse, but even his apologies sound mechanical, as though he is reciting lines he hopes will grant him release. For many, the idea of Chapman walking free feels like reopening a wound the world has never fully healed. What leads a man to kill someone he admired? What transforms a fan into an assassin? And how does a single moment of violence change the course of music, culture, and human history? There are no clean answers, only fragments. A troubled childhood, a battle with fame, a man whose ideals often collided with his flaws, another man whose loneliness metastasized into obsession, a government that feared a musician, a world that watched history unfold live on television, and a legacy that refuses to fade. John Lennon's life was brilliant, his death was tragic, and the truth that remains is as sharp today as it was that night. Violence took him, but it did not silence him. His influence echoes in the way people remember him, in the music that still fills rooms across the world, and in the idea he repeated again and again, that even the smallest voice can push back against chaos. The story does not end with the shooter, the autopsy, or the tragedy. It continues in the lives changed by his work, in the art shaped by his courage, and in the countless people who found strength in his words. And in that echo, John Lennon remains, not as a myth, not as an icon, but as a reminder, fragile, flawed, human, of how powerful a single life can be. If this story stayed with you, don't leave in silence. Like the video, share it, and tell me in the comments what truth you think the world still refuses to see.